Good morning, students, and welcome to another episode of Political Sociology. And the topic this week is a vexing, I would say, complex topic related to what is sometimes described as identity politics. And I should say that as I'm putting the slides together, thinking about what I'd like to say about this topic, I find it difficult because in some ways we've skimmed the edges of this identity politics issue, and now we're going to address it more directly. But it's not an easy topic to capture because there are different ways that people have defined identity politics and in particular critiqued identity politics from both the left and the right. And identity politics is often used as a term to denigrate a particular style of politics. Again, from both the left and the right. So it's a little tricky. I'm going to touch on various themes. I'm hoping that you will read the 3 articles. I think that will clarify some of the issues and debates. The Benn-Michaels piece is very important, particularly important, I think, for sociology students who take courses in race, sex, social class, courses that spend enormous amounts of time talking about levels of inequality, how we think about inequality. And Benn-Michaels points out a very, very critical distinction between different forms of inequality and how we think about addressing those. And in some ways, you might find his position, as many people often do when they first read his work, and I would put with him the work of Adolf Reed, and I would encourage you to look at his work if you're interested, in a certain critique of left liberal political strategy and political action. And often when people read pieces by Benn-Michaels, for example, there's another article, I think it might be in the readings canvas, some kind of title like, "What's so great about diversity?" What's so great about diversity? And the typical sociology student, of course, is to some extent socialized in valuing diversity for diversity's sake. And they might often think, well, if somebody is questioning the value of diversity, maybe they're coming from some kind of right-wing reactionary position, when in fact Benn-Michaels as well as Adolf Reed are both actually coming from the left. So that's what complicates the conversation about identity politics. I just wanted to start with that. It's early morning and my throat is going through its usual congested state. So excuse me if there are moments when I am coughing, clearing my throat, trying to drink some water to help. It is an early morning lecture I'm giving today. All right, let's get started with this topic. And of course, my remote only works sometimes. There we go. You could spend a whole semester talking about the concept of identity and social identity, both in psychology and sociology. There's social identity theory. So everyone has, to some extent, some kind of identity. We often talk about the statuses that people occupy and the extent to which those statuses define who they are. And that, in a sense, is identity. And that's an important, very important sociological concept. And your identity often shapes how you think, how you act. You think about your relationship between a reference group, other people that share your identity. All of these things are critical sociological phenomenon. So, when I think about identity generally, it's not surprising that you would expect identity to have some impact on politics, clearly. Some people think that there has to be some level of identity among a collective in order for them to act politically, that they have something in common, some identity in common that they share, and that in turn shapes maybe the political ambitions and goals and visions that they have. And clearly identity is used as a way to mobilize. So we have to think of this both in terms of how we identify personally and how organizations, and for political sociology, the most significant is political parties, how political parties shape our identity. So a lot of identity in the political realm has been aimed at both asserting one's identity as a legitimate form of membership that should be recognized and that should be a source of pride. So we have a long history of social movements. And social movements, again, one of the structural factors that shapes identity, and obviously social movements are politically directed, and they have political aims. Performativity is a term we use often, and that is, how does one express themselves in ways that communicate their identity, or that communicate their respect for particular group identities. And this has become a major issue in terms of, I think, something I might have referred to before, woke culture, wokeness, the Black Lives Matter movement, people expressing themselves in ways that endorse and recognize those movements, as well as the actual participants within the Black Lives Matter movement, the actual participants that are behind the movement. So you define and construct your identity by doing. It's an important way to think about one's identity. You become by doing. If you define yourself as a political activist, you validate and reinforce your identity by actually doing things which you associate with political activism. That's another way to think about this concept of performativity, which is a term that's widely used now in the social sciences, and particularly in sociology. Another way to think about identity, this is very sociological, a lot of sociological work has been done on this, is reactive, racial, ethnic, gender identity. So if somebody identifies themselves, let's say, I discuss this sometimes in my intro class when I talk about status, right? Like, what is somebody's master status? What does that mean? That means if you ask them, who are you? How do you define yourself? Does someone, when you ask them that question, respond, for example, I'm a Latino woman? That's their identity. Now, often what people will say, and you hear this often from sort of mainstream, dominant, racial, ethnic groups, white Americans, is, why do people always emphasize their, racial and ethnic identity? That shouldn't be important. That shouldn't matter, right? And the point is that people identify themselves in particular ways based on the extent to which that racial, ethnic membership, for example, matters, whether it's significant, whether it has any impact in their life, whether it shapes the way people react to them or interact with them, or whether it affects their life chances. Right? And often this depends on where you are, what the situation is, who you're surrounded by. So when we talk about the extent to which one has, as an identity, a particular gender, a particular sexuality, a particular ethnicity, a particular racial membership or category, it's significant, and its significance will shape whether people view it and view themselves within that social identity group. You don't typically, if you ask, let's say white males in the United States, it's unusual that somebody would say, I'm an Irish male. I'm an Irish man. You might say, well, you are Irish, right? You have Irish ancestry. Why don't you mention that? Because it's insignificant. It doesn't matter. It has no significant impact on how people react to them, their life chances, any aspect of their day-to-day life. And therefore, it isn't an identity, right? So identities are activated, so to speak, by the way in which the larger society treats people who are in particular kinds of, and in our society, most significantly, racial and ethnic categories. So this is just ways to think about identity generally, but you can also think about that reactive identity in terms of how it galvanizes political orientation and action. Okay, what do we mean by identity politics? There's lots of definitions, and again, because it tends to be a politically charged term, coming from the left, sometimes from the right, and it's often used as a negative way to describe politics. There are lots of definitions, okay? This is one. Political action based on advancing rights, respect, representation for various status groups. Racial groups, gender groups, ethnicity groups, sexual orientation, what have you, right? And we can think about movements that are related to these particular social status categories. And when people study identity politics, they're studying the experience of people, the cultural features of that identity, and how all this translates into political action, political mobilization, and power or powerlessness. Right. So political action that's based on membership in a particular status group. Okay. Little background here. These are just a bunch of terms and issues related to this larger question. I didn't want to go there. Okay. Something that came up in the readings on race and politics. This is an ongoing debate on the left. When we think about what to emphasize politically, should we focus on race or should we focus on class? Is one primary? Is one secondary? Does promotion of anti-racism address the class inequality issue? Does the emphasis on class, which is the more pure left orientation, incorporate race? So this is a ongoing debate. Again, you had a reading by, I think, Cedric Johnson. Adolph Reed is heavily involved in this conversation as well, to the extent that in some ways he criticizes Black Lives Matter from a left perspective, because he thinks it's emphasizing anti-racism, which doesn't get at the source of the problem in a capitalist society. All right. So when you see critiques of movements that you think are progressive, it's very important to look at exactly what the basis of that critique is, because you might often assume it's from some right-wing reactionary position. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily entirely unfounded or wrong, but you need to know what the politics are that motivates these criticisms. Failure of class-based political action. So the general kind of critique, and we're going to touch on various aspects of this, is that if you're focusing on promoting particular groups, advancing their interests, you are producing a certain level of fragmentation rather than collective solidarity. What should collective solidarity be based on if you are coming from the left, where much of these debates are taking place? It should be based on social class first and foremost. So this is a legitimate debate. Reasonable people on the left disagree on the primacy of one versus the other and how to think about it politically. And of course, how to think about it strategically. The personal is political is a term that emerged back in my day with the women's movement and other social movements. And the idea is that your personal experiences, your personal day-to-day experiences, your private experiences are in and of themselves political because they are shaped by larger structures of hierarchy and power, patriarchy, etc. Right? So often what happens is this produces a way of thinking about your personal experiences and the personal interactions you have day to day and focusing on those. And again, in terms of the criticism, some people would say that often distracts from the larger effort to mobilize people against a transformation of the political economic system. Privatized activism is a term I sort of invented back in the 60s when you had, at first, people who were on the left and wanted to, hopefully, mobilize working class people around some kind of left-wing revolutionary movement. Over time, they became very disappointed and very alienated. The working class wasn't meeting their historic mission, if you're a Marxist. And, in fact, many of the working class people seem to be rather conservative in supporting, the Vietnam War. And they weren't getting behind major social movements. And so many of these activists became estranged, alienated, and they decided what they would do was, rather than try to mobilize some mass nationwide political class-based movement, they would live a certain kind of lifestyle. So the sort of caricature of this is you had all these leftists. Maybe Bernie was a part of this, but Bernie didn't just go privatized, right? They all moved to Vermont, and they live out in the country, and they grow their own food, and they compost their garbage, and they live a particular lifestyle, but it's privatized activism. You understand? It's their private life is lived a certain way, they have a certain identity, they practice certain things, but they are not promoting any kind of widespread public political agenda. And you saw a lot of this on the left, and then a lot of this ends up getting into the personalist political and a focus on certain status groups and advancing the interest of particular status groups. Cultural politics versus class politics. To a large extent, what we have in the United States is a cultural politics division between, if we talk about the division between the Democrats and the Republicans, it's not class-based, it's more culture-based. And so many people believe that the identity politics has kind of played into this cultural politics. And for those people, they want a class-based politics. They don't want a culture-based, but they don't want a culture war. They want a class war. They want class struggle. They want class conflict, class warfare, not cultural warfare. And I'm working on an essay on this topic. The title is that a class war is better than a culture war, unless you're a capitalist. And the idea is that the capitalist class, the corporate elite, are perfectly happy seeing the American population divided along these cultural lines. One way to think about the cultural divide is cosmopolitan, the educated, versus the traditionalists, right? The traditional people have traditional values. Maybe they have less education. Maybe they're less sophisticated, less cosmopolitan. You have this kind of split between cosmopolitan and traditionalists. That's not a class split, and in fact, it doesn't necessarily align in any significant way with political economic policies or ideology. So some people worry that identity politics plays into that, right? And that's a form of identity. In sociology, we talk about universalism versus particularism. If you're focusing on a particular group, or you're a member of a particular group and your primary emphasis is to advance the interests of your status group, the group you identify with, that's a form of particularism. Universalism is trying to find a basis that connects all of the different marginalized groups into a cohesive social movement. This is the big challenge that people find on the left. A biracial, multi-ethnic, multi-sexuality movement of working people. Working people. That would be the common element. So people who critique identity politics often say it's a form of particularism rather than universalism. Rather than having policies that focus on advancing the interest of a particular group, we need to have universal policies. So this has enormous implications for public policies. Means tested, policies that focus on advancing the interests, the inclusion, the representation of a particular status group, or do we try to have universal policies that include all citizens as eligible for certain kinds of benefits? Going back to Adolph Reed, one example here would be reparations. That's a huge issue. Obviously, reparations, the reparations debate, the reparations proposal is directed at black Americans as a compensatory policy, and Reed actually opposes that from the left. And I've written a few things about that as well. For Reed, the issue is, what are the political implications of that policy? How does that advance the larger vision we have of a social movement that is biracial, multiracial, multi-ethnic, etc.? Okay, fragmentation versus collective unity. You understand what I'm saying. So when you begin to think about identity politics, you begin to think about all of these particular status groups that in some sense are operating as interest groups. And the critique on identity politics is largely directed at the Democratic Party, which has cultivated identity politics. Before, I said that people have an identity themselves, but that identity can also be galvanized and energized and cultivated by political organizations, most important, political parties. And that has seemed to be, and I'll say more about this, the position of the Democratic Party. Richard Rorty, very prominent philosopher who did a lot of writing on American politics, political dynamics. He's no longer alive, but he talked about the cultural left. And the cultural left was a description of a tendency that Rorty was criticizing. And it falls into many of the identity politics issues we're discussing here. So, if the personal is political, many people have focused their attention on microaggression. You probably heard this term. We need to be fighting microaggression, the way people interact with us at this micro level. They interact with us in a way that is oppressive, and reflects maybe some kind of hierarchy. And some people say the emphasis on microaggression often distracts us from the larger issue of class exploitation. In other words, if individuals are treated well interpersonally and they do not detect or perceive aggression, that somehow this is the most important accomplishment. From the left, people would say, well, that doesn't really significantly solve the larger problem of the way the political economic system of capitalism is organized. That doesn't get us very far. Right? White fragility, white privilege, getting people to acknowledge their privilege, and the fact that they are unable to acknowledge racism, racial oppression. So once people are aware of that, once they have gone through the training sessions, where does that leave us? I'm not saying these are insignificant accomplishments, politically, socially, but what I'm pointing to is a larger debate that's taking place. Where does this get us in terms of addressing the fundamental bases of power and exploitation within the political economic system? These are the ways in which people are discussing, arguing, debating, and often disagreeing about where our priorities should be placed politically. So you can define identity politics. You can describe it. Here, we are also talking about the political implications as a strategy. I did want to make reference to William Julius Wilson. William Julius Wilson, I believe he is still alive, is a sociologist, very prominent sociologist. Had some major writings back in the 80s, in the 90s, early 2000s, focusing on the political economy of race, deindustrialization, inequality, etc. And William Julius Wilson wrote a book called The Declining Significance of Race. And this title alone created an enormous kind of backlash against Wilson. And what Wilson was trying to argue was historically much of the disadvantage that Black Americans experienced were a result of kind of explicit forms of racial discrimination. However, he believed that when he was writing, the current state of what he called the underclass, and of course that became a very controversial term, but he was talking about the percentage of the Black population that was essentially in deep levels of economic deprivation and poverty and unemployment, joblessness, etc. He said much of this has less to do with being Black, according to Julius Wilson, than being working class. And because Blacks are disproportionately represented in the working class, the neoliberal policies that were being enacted during the 80s and the 90s when he was writing have a disproportionate negative impact on Black Americans. And so his point was, attacking racism and discrimination is not going to get at the source of the problem, because the problem is the way in which, under neoliberalism, the political economy has been reorganized in ways that disproportionately affect Black Americans. Now, historically, the racism and the discrimination placed Black Americans within a particular occupational location, disproportionately. Then when you have neoliberalism, which is a capitalist class, versus working class. Obviously, the capitalist class imposes their power. The working class suffers generally, and of course, blacks disproportionately. So his arguments were, if we want to solve the problem, we need to promote what he called universal policies. That is, policies that are directed not particularly at blacks, that's particularism, universally for all working people. And if you have working class policies, that is, policies that promote the power, the bargaining power of the working class, blacks will disproportionately benefit because they are disproportionately represented. So he took a lot of heat because he was essentially saying race is becoming less important as a factor and class is becoming more important as a factor. He was coming from the left in his analysis, and people responded to this. So again, this is just one example of how this debate over the forms of stratification, right? We have this class in the sociology department, sex, race, and social class, right? The three dimensions of stratification. Is one more important than the other? When you think about political strategy, and Wilson focused on class. Okay. So what is social justice? Again, debates about this also revolve around identity politics. Nancy Fraser, you read some of her work earlier in the semester. I've made reference to it. She talks about progressive neoliberalism. We'll talk about that in a moment. Is it the politics of redistribution? That's material redistribution, redistribution of resources, redistribution of wealth, redistribution of income. Or is social justice the politics of recognition? That we simply need to acknowledge and recognize the rights of all groups. That is the sum and substance of social justice, or does social justice involve something more substantive from her perspective? Okay. Now, she has a position, and her position is that the politics of recognition doesn't get us very far. The politics of redistribution does. Why is one more acceptable than the other? I want you to think about that. To the larger population, including elites. So identity politics, the politics of recognition, inclusion, acceptance, representation. That's the goal, presumably, of identity politics. We have a term, identitarianism. Identitarianism, okay? I can't say that. But that is a term that describes the tendency for politics to focus more on the identity of particular groups, mobilizing those groups around the identity, than around a fundamental movement to restructure the political economic system. And so many people are critical of identitarianism. All right, so just to go back to something we discussed earlier in the semester, so you can get a feel for this, because to some extent, she's touching on the identity politics of, let's just say, the Democratic Party, okay? What she calls progressive neoliberalism. The key point here is that we're retaining the neoliberal political economic system, but we're approaching it in a more progressive way. And she says this is based on an alliance of mainstream currents of social movements. This is the identity, feminism, anti-racism, multiculturalism, LGBTQ plus rights. Democratic Party is associated with all of these movements and promoting the inclusion, the representation of these groups. Recognition, the politics of recognition. At the same time, progressive neoliberalism of perhaps the Democratic Party or a significant segment of the Democratic Party is closely aligned with particular business sectors. She calls them high-end, symbolic, and service-based business sectors: Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and Hollywood. In this alliance, progressive forces are effectively joined with the forces of cognitive capitalism. This is a term to describe sort of digitally energized sectors of the economy, which also include the financial sector. Obviously, it includes Silicon Valley. She says especially financialization, because financialization is a significant aspect of neoliberalism, and the Democratic Party has very strong connections to and receives enormous campaign contributions from the financial sector. So, you have right neoliberalism, reactionary neoliberalism versus progressive neoliberalism. The point is, they are both neoliberalism. And so, the left, we like to think of that as the oppositional, is to some extent a form of what we might call artificial negativity. Now, what is identity politics promoting? As some people say, equal opportunity exploitation. We're not eliminating exploitation of the capitalist system that's inherent to the capitalist system. We're simply saying that everyone should have the opportunity to be exploited across the entire stratification system. People should be represented. Social justice is equal representation. So, equal opportunity exploitation is just a term to get at the problem with identity politics as it's been practiced. Social justice as equal representation, period. All right. I want you to read the Benn-Michaels article, obviously. It's important. And there is a lot there to digest. I just want to touch on one aspect of his argument and do it in graphic form. Sometimes this helps people think about the issue. So you can think of these shapes: triangles, squares, circles, diamonds, as racial, ethnic groups. And the image on the top, that's individual inequality with horizontal inequality. And he makes this distinction. So you need to understand the distinction between individual inequality versus horizontal inequality. Horizontal inequality is often associated with people who point to the disparities between groups. The disparity between, median white income versus median black. What's the disparity, right? So just like we have the identitarianism, we have disparitarianism, people who focus on disparities. And what we need to do is eliminate the disparities. We need to eliminate the discrimination on which those disparities are based. So, in the top image, what you have is the diamonds are obviously the dominant. The triangle is the dominant group. The diamond is the ultimate subordinate group. This is basically looks like a class system. In the sense that if you're a diamond, you're basically at the bottom. If you're a triangle, you're at the top. It's a caste system. So you have inequality here, but you also have horizontal inequality. What would individual inequality look like without horizontal inequality? Because what Benn-Michaels is getting at is people want to eliminate the disparities. They want representation. Some groups are more likely to be in a particular social category than another. That's a disparity in the stratification system. How do we solve that? Well, we solve that through equal opportunities to enter into whatever occupation, educational level, social class position you want. So what you have now is at the bottom, you still have individual inequality. That hasn't changed at all. You still have a highly stratified system. But each group is represented. You see that, right? So to be a diamond does not determine what social class you're in. To be a circle does not determine what class you're in. You could say these are cross-cutting cleavages. That diamond in the top left, does that person associate with the upper class, the top strata? Or that would be horizontally. Or do they identify with the other diamonds, the vertical dimension? So the point is, distributing the population equally, and this would eliminate disparities, distributing the population equally. So if we have, if 12% of the population is black in the United States, if 12% of the capitalist class are black, you solve the problem. From the horizontal inequality problem. But you haven't done anything about the individual inequality problem. You haven't done anything about the exploitative nature of the capitalist system. The inequality could be exactly the same, could be as extreme as it is today. Income inequality, wealth inequality. The only difference is this what we want to accomplish? That every group is represented proportionally within the stratification system. This is what Benn-Michaels is trying to get at. And for him, we need to address the individual inequality as importantly as the horizontal. All right, here's another way to put it. In the context of the disparitarian, the problem becomes not the unjust exploitative system itself, but rather the lack of minority representation within it. When you read the articles on gender and politics, on feminism, often there is a celebration of the fact that some woman is now occupying a position in the corporate elite, right? And there was a criticism of that. At one time, that was it, this aspirational idea, or what I think Featherstone or maybe a Sarah Jaffee called trickle-down feminism, right? That is that individuals who make it into those positions represent, it's a victory for feminism. But it does nothing to address the larger experience of the vast majority of women, right? And it glorifies a particular position at the top of the hierarchy. And that should trickle down, right, in terms of uplift and aspiration. So Benn-Michaels is promoting something more radical. And it's important to understand why it is that almost all corporations that are highly exploitative in terms of how they treat their employees, in terms of the disparity in income between the corporate elite in that particular organization, the capitalist class, the owners, the CEOs, whatever you want to call them, and the rest of the working population. But at the same time, they're very open to diversity plans, diversity policies. They have, CEOs that are responsible for ensuring that there's opportunities for women, blacks, Hispanics, etc., to occupy positions within the organization. They support diversity. They support inclusion. But then they turn around and they impose minimum wage legislation, living wage legislation, progressive taxation. Because diversity and inclusion, as praiseworthy a political goal as it is, does nothing to challenge in any way the sources of their power and domination. It goes back to the term by Fraser, politics of redistribution or the politics of recognition. We'll recognize, we'll include, we will allow different groups to be represented. That's perfectly fine. We need more diversity. We're all for that. But redistribution? Redistribution of income and wealth and property? No. So, politically, how far does this get us? And this has been the critique of identity politics, that it is essentially hurt the Democratic Party, assuming the Democratic Party is interested in actually promoting any kind of broader class-based politics, which I don't think they are. But the point is that it's hurt them electorally because it looks as if the Democratic Party is simply a party that's interested in promoting the rights, the inclusion, or representation of particular groups. And that's going to solve the issue. And this becomes a substitute. So over the last 20 to 30 years, as inequality has increased, inequality in income, inequality in wealth, the Democratic Party has not focused on the question of inequality. It's focused on the question of representation, recognition, equal rights, access, equal opportunity, and particularly equal opportunity, meritocracy. What that means is every person should have equal opportunity to obtain an education to make it. Some level of mobility. None of this questions, challenges the level of inequality in wealth, in income, the stratified nature of capitalism, the social relations of capitalism. None of that is discussed. None of that is challenged. Just want to make sure that each group has the same opportunity, the same rights, get an education, use their skills and energy and talents to go as far as they possibly can, as far as they desire. You've heard this kind of language over and over again. Mobility. They want everyone to have an equal opportunity to be unequal. Another way to put it. There are currently a number of books that are coming out. There's a backlash against meritocracy, basically. Meritocracy as a concept, meritocracy as a way it's been used. Often this is directed at the Democratic Party that tends to elevate educational credentials to the highest level in terms of evaluating the contribution of individuals, the value of people, and what you ultimately need if you are making insufficient amounts of income, suffering from economic insecurity. What you need to do is you need to get more education. This is the answer. This is the panacea. Right? So, people have been writing about the fact that meritocracy has become a way that people essentially justify the positions they're in. Well, meritocracy, presumably meritocracy means that you allocate positions and income and wealth and influence and power on the basis of what people have accomplished based on their merit. So, if we have a meritocracy, and if you promote meritocracy as a principle, how do people feel that are economically deprived, that don't have much political power, much economic power, are living with economic insecurity? Well, we have a meritocracy, and we have equal opportunity to educational resources. So if somebody is suffering economically, they have no one to blame but themselves. So we have several books. I'll show you one I'm reading now. It's outstanding. This is, let's see if I can put this. There we go. Okay. The Tyranny of Merit. Meritocracy used to be a principle that everyone agreed. Of course, we should be, hiring people on a basis of merit. But we know that the ability to get merit is obviously unequally distributed. And the question is whether that should be the single basis on which one is able to move up or down or experience economic security. And what does it say to the losers? What does it say to those who don't have a college education? So Sandel, Michael Sandel, he's a very well-known, prominent political philosopher, just wrote this book, The Tyranny of Merit, and he talks about the rhetoric of rising. Much of the book is a critique of the Democratic Party, or the liberal class, as Thomas Frank would describe them, and how they glorify credentials, education, and because of that, they totally demoralize a significant portion of the population. This creates resentment and hostility toward the highly educated, who are presumably the experts, the ones who are in the know, the ones who should be making the decisions. And of course, this plays into the hands of right-wing populism. So for Sandel, much of what we're seeing today, the culture war between particular segments of the American population, is attributable to the way in which the Democratic Party, liberals, have approached the question of inequality and meritocracy. And let's see. Here's another one. I can't read too many of these books, but The Meritocracy Trap. I said there's a backlash against meritocracy. Another book that was just written called The Cult of Smart. The Cult of Smart. And that individual makes a somewhat more controversial argument. And the argument is that not everyone has the ability to excel in an academic institution. Doesn't mean they're stupid. Doesn't mean they lack intelligence. It simply means that not everyone has that particular talent, that particular skill. So why do we, as a society, hold up as the single most legitimate basis on which to allocate money, resources, prestige, status, wealth, income, how well you do in school, or how many credentials you have? Now, the controversial part is the claim that people have different inherent levels of skill and talent. I don't know if this author uses intelligence. I haven't read the book. But the point is, that's just another recent publication coming from somebody who historically has been to the left. And when you start talking about inherent differences between people in terms of their abilities, and he's not saying it's correlated with race or ethnicity or anything like that, or religion, or gender. He simply says that it's a fact that there are these variations. And so we can't just assume that everybody is going to excel in a particular institutional environment, and that institutional environment and what that institutional environment gives people, and those are credentials, should be the single basis on which we allocate and justify how much income and wealth people have. So Sandel talks about the rhetoric of rising. Everyone can rise, everyone can make it. There's social mobility, there's equal opportunity. We just have to open the gates and everyone will have a chance. Equal opportunity to be unequal does nothing at all to address the unequal distribution of income and the unequal distribution of wealth. That is the key point here. Okay, I'm hammering this home. What about white voters? Are they an identity group? Is that identity politics? Of course, there's been a lot written, enormous amounts written about the white working class. It's funny, when people use the term working class, it's often assumed that they're talking about white people. Even though blacks are disproportionately represented in any measure of what we would call the working class, whatever way you want to determine who belongs or who doesn't. And clearly, it is an identity politics that is now being used, certainly by Donald Trump and by the right. The right populism is definitely based on a kind of cultural chauvinism, if you like, ethno-racial nationalism, and this notion of whiteness. There's been a lot written about that over the last 10 years, and particularly over the last 4 years. And if we think about reactive ethnicity, you might say, well, people may not identify as white if it isn't significant, right? If they have white privilege, if it in no way affects how people interact with them or the opportunities for them, like we said, somebody identifies as black, or somebody identifies as Latina, Hispanic, that is something we would probably expect given the nature of the society in which we live and the kind of experiences that people who are a member of those groups daily face. But we now see this notion of whiteness. And it's reactive because, first of all, you can gin people up by telling them that you will be replaced, they are taking over, the country is changing, this was a white Christian nation. You hear all this kind of language being used, and it's being transformed. And one of these slogans of the white supremacists marching in Charlottesville was, "We will not be replaced." So clearly, this has become another aspect of the culture war, dividing working class people. As I said, what I'm writing about and really advocating is a class war. I don't know what form that would take. Right now we have an asymmetric class war, that is, a capitalist class is beating the hell out of the working class. I'm talking about class conflict, class struggle between working class people and capitalists is better than a culture war, which is the source of the polarization that people bemoan today in the political system. Okay, so this is a diagram I put together some time ago talking about the nature of the Democratic Party using the concept of Nancy Fraser, progressive neoliberalism. And you can see that the neoliberal aspects, as well as the what are called progressive aspects. DIM, at one point I was using the acronym DIM, diversity, innovation, and meritocracy. And, what is progressive? It's progressive to promote innovation and cognitive capitalism, particular industries that are on the cutting edge. This was viewed as a kind of progressive thing. But what I'm pointing to, as you move from the left to the right, you see that promoting these kinds of presumably progressive factors, movements, developments, has not produced anything that is ultimately progressive or transformative. Yes, we have enormous innovation in the technology sector. What has it given us? We thought it would be the great leveler. Everyone would have access to the internet. It would be sharing information, widespread participation, distribution of power. What do we have instead? We have surveillance capitalism. We have technology being used to monitor levels of productivity of workers in factories and offices. Of course, the question has always been, who controls the technology? It's not neutral. Who controls it and how is it used and for whose purposes? And within the context of a capitalist economy, obviously, it's the capitalist class that has the greatest ability to use the technology for their own interests. So we have surveillance capitalism. If you haven't read that book, Shoshana Zuboff wrote a book called Surveillance Capitalism. It's a magnificent, I would call it a magnum opus, explaining exactly within a kind of, she uses Marxian concepts, although I don't think she's a Marxist, to describe what's happening in the social media, high-tech economy, Google, Amazon, Facebook. We have toxic financial instruments. The innovation in the financial sector actually created instruments, investment instruments and vehicles which contributed to the great financial crisis. We're not benefiting from that. And of course, they've used their technology, their technological innovation, to extract money from people's accounts in very underhanded ways. And we have oligopoly within the tech sector. The tech sector is essentially dominated by 3 or 4 firms, and so we're at their mercy. So that's the innovation cognitive capitalism, which presumably was a kind of progressive capitalist development. Didn't turn out that way. Education and meritocracy, we've already talked about that. What has it produced? What we have today is hereditary meritocracy. What that means is the amount of merit you have, the amount of education you have, the quantity and quality of education you have is largely a result of how much wealth and income your parents have. The correlation is extremely, extremely strong. It's created this idea of professional managerial privilege. This is discussed when you read the article by Thomas Frank from Listen Liberal. And the Democratic Party has essentially become a party of professionals, highly educated professionals. And we have massive student debt for those who have been told that that's all you have to do is get an education. We live in a meritocracy. The key to success, the key to rising, the key to upward mobility is getting a college degree, etc. This has produced student debt. So that's where that's taken us. So the 3 elements of progressive neoliberalism certainly have not challenged neoliberal political economy, and they have turned out to be somewhat regressive in their impact. And diversity, we've already talked about how identity politics, disparitarianism creates, in many ways, bigger problems than it solves. So out of all this, we've had growing individual inequality. all of these features, the innovation, right? Because people say the key to ensuring that we have an economic system that benefits people, innovation is important. So they glorify innovation, right? And if you think about it, over the last 20 years, the level of innovation has probably been as high as it has ever been in terms of technological, information technology innovation. Probably been nothing like it over the last 20 years. During that period of massive innovation, what have we seen? Record levels of inequality of income, record levels of inequality of wealth, and let's move down to education and meritocracy. The millennial generation, the most highly educated generation in history, the most economically insecure. Diversity, let's encourage people to strive. Let's eliminate the obstacles. Let's eliminate any forms of discrimination, inclusion, representation. This has not in any way addressed the inequality issue as well. All right, this is the last item I want to show you, how the identity politics issue plays out. I don't know if you can see all this. Let's see if I can move this. Let me back it up. All right. There was an interaction that took place. I think this is probably back when Bernie Sanders was running in 2016. And a woman got up and she said, how could she become the second Latina senator, the U.S. Senate? She was asking Sanders this, and people were cheering and everything. And he said, let me respond. He said, in a way you may not be happy with. And this sort of gets at this tension, right? Because his point is, sure, we need lots of representation of all groups in society. But he says, it's not good enough to say, hey, I'm a Latina, vote for me. It's not good enough. I have to know whether that Latina is going to stand up with the working class of this country, is going to take on big money interests. One of the struggles that we're going to have right now, we lay on the table the Democratic Party. It's not good enough to me, he's saying. Okay, well, we'll have X number of African Americans here. We'll have Y number of Latinos there. Z number of women here. You see what he's getting at. His response is reflecting this issue of representation versus fundamental policy change. Okay? So he says that's not good enough to have a certain number of African Americans, certain number of Latinos, certain number of women. He said that's not good enough. He said we need that diversity. Of course, that goes without saying. That's accepted. Right now, we've made progress in getting women into politics. He goes on to say, but here's my point. This is where this is going to be division within the Democratic Party. This is the debate, exactly. This conversation, this response to this woman reflects the very issue. And the fact that Sanders responds this way, in a way that probably was not what this person was expecting, nor maybe the audience that was listening to this, points to the fact that he's actually coming from a left position, where he believes the point is that we need to promote policies that benefit the entire working class, and it doesn't matter what the representation is, ultimately, of the people who are in the movement. Obviously, you want as many people as possible. You want as much diversity as possible. But that alone does not in any way get you where you want to go politically. So he says, if that guy is going to be shipping jobs out of the country and exploiting his workers, it doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot if he's black or white or Latino. So the politics of representation versus the politics of redistribution, to get at Fraser's point. Okay, as I said, this is a difficult topic to easily capture in a single lecture, but I've tried to point to the political implications of what is regarded as identity politics. I hope you have an understanding of that. Of course, any questions you have, please let me know. I'm no longer using VoiceThread. I'm just using the other system, so you can direct your questions to me. Okay, thank you.